Yeah, so thanks for having me out, and thanks for being here. Talk is on the function of functional division. So the human cortical visual system is divided into two distinct processing streams. Ventral stream, here in purple, extending laterally from V1 into the inferotemporal cortex, and a dorsal stream here in green, extending dorsally from V1 into the posterior parietal lobe. So on what has become the dominant account, the streams perform separate person-level functions. The ventral stream processes largely conscious representations for the broader guidance of cognitive activity. That is, it processes what's called vision for perception. And the dorsal stream aids in the guidance of online motor control. That is, it processes what's called vision for action. So you can get a better kind of sense of this model as being motivated by explaining an apparent double disassociation between conscious experience and online visual motor control. So we can see that with a pair of cases. This first is so-called cortical blind subjects who have isolated damage to ventral stream, resulting in a deficit in conscious experience without a corresponding deficit in online visual motor guidance. So this is a cortically blind subject who reports an inability to see anything in the hallway. He previously thought he was more or less entirely blind, but a surprising ability to navigate around objects. You can see that there's a kind of non-happenstance in his behavior that seems to involve him visually moving around objects. This looks like a case of motor guidance without conscious perception. Optic ataxics are just the opposite case, right? So this subject is able to report pretty normal conscious experiences. She's able, for example, to give precise descriptions of the objects in front of her, about their distance and spatial relations and so forth. But as you'll kind of see as this video carries on, that she's unable to reliably use vision to guide her actions. This deficit seems restricted to visual guidance, as she's able to perform normally at motor tasks that don't require visual guidance. So optic ataxia results from isolated damage to dorsal stream, resulting in a deficit in motor guidance without a corresponding deficit in conscious experience. So the argument goes like this. There's a double disassociation between conscious experience on the one hand, which seems to be driven by the ventral stream, and visual motor guidance, which seems to be driven by the dorsal stream. So philosophers talking about the two visual streams have largely focused on this aspect of the two streams model, the idea that there's unconscious perception driving our motor activity. So I actually think this emphasis on experience is a little overemphasized, and actually that the most crucial aspects of the model are functional, not about experience, but I'll get to that in a moment. But this is just to say that I wanted to give you a kind of idea of what the model says, but in a moment I'm going to kind of refine it by describing it in functional terms. So before this division in visual processing, there's an earlier and much less controversial one. Visual information is passed from the retina down the optic nerve and eventually to primary visual cortex. Along the way, it passes through a kind of relay station in the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus, here the LGN. Visual information from the LGN, however, passes in two different directions along what they call roads. So there's a low road which outputs directly to the amygdala, and a high road which outputs directly to the cortical visual system, what we just got done talking about. So there are some quibbles about exactly what's going on with this independent low road, but it's broadly agreed that the function of the additional low road of visual processing is to trigger something like fight or flight responses to threatening stimuli. So that is, you know, if you imagine you see a snake, you're going to have this kind of trigger that causes you to flee. The story goes the low road is responsible for very quickly activating programs like flee or freeze or fight, that kind of thing. Okay, so these are all answers to what I'll be calling the first order question. That's the question about the local function of a visual processing stream. So on the view I've just rehearsed, which I'll largely be assuming, there are at least 3 visual processing streams, each with a different local function. There's a stream processing vision for conscious perception. There's a stream processing vision for online motor control. And there's a stream processing vision for threat detection and response. I'll call this phenomenon of separate visual processing streams performing different roles functional division. So in this talk, I'm going to be discussing a different question, what I call a second order question about visual processing, which is, what is the function of this functional division? Why does the mind divide and conquer in this way instead of unite and build? So the dominant answer to this question, to this second order question, is what I'll call task-based division. This is the claim that different person-level tasks place conflicting demands on computational systems, and that meeting these conflicting demands is best accomplished by a divide and conquer strategy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise 3 problems for the task-based account and propose a new computation-based division in visual processing. According to the latter, there are intrinsic benefits to employing combinations of what I'll call coupled and decoupled computations in solving perception action problems, and the 3 visual streams realize that kind of division. Okay, so most of the literature on the 2 streams has focused on various aspects of the first order question, that is, about the local function of each individual stream. So you might wonder why we should want an answer to the second order question about the function of functional division. And I think there are at least 3 reasons. So first, understanding the general reasons why mental systems divide and conquer can help us understand the functions of particular streams. In this case, since the 3 visual streams coordinate in the performance of their tasks, understanding how they work together can help us understand how they function individually. Second, understanding the general reasons for division can help us predict when there should be other such divisions. So what I'm going to suggest is that the right answer to the second order question helps us see that there are likely more individual streams than the standardly discussed 2. And finally, understanding the broader role of functional division can help us in general theorizing about mental function. It tells us how different systems interact, for example, with cognition, and it gives us clues for how functional division might work elsewhere in the mind. Okay, so the rest of the talk is going to have 4 sections. I'm going to go through some preliminaries, just kind of talking about the background. Then I'm going to go through the dominant task-based division answer to this second order question. I'm going to raise 3 problems, and then I'm going to provide my own account. Okay. So let's get to the preliminaries. So I said there was going to be a different way of understanding this division in the visual system, and I'd like to describe that now. This is going to be a kind of more functionally described division in the visual system. So to explain their model, in addition to thinking about conscious perception and action, Milner and Goodall draw an analogy to a hypothetical Martian rover. So the rover's job is to navigate the Martian terrain and collect samples. To accomplish these goals, the rover is fitted with communication equipment, which allow remote control of its overall behavior from Earth. To the rover's action plan, mission control determines what the rover sensors tell us about the rover's nearby environment and send an action program describing what it should do next. But since there is substantial delay between Earth and Mars, it would be inadvisable for the rover to simply execute precise movements on the basis of mission control's action programs. Rather, the rover should update the program in response to in-the-moment conditions. Thus, the rover is fitted with an additional onboard system, which independently assesses the scene and makes fine-grained adjustments to the action program. So for example, if a rock blows in the way, it can navigate around it. When picking up samples, it can use its sensors in the moment to guide its limbs towards the target, and things like that. The overall behavior of the rover is thus controlled by 2 systems. A smart but slow controller system, which selects action programs for the rover, and a crude but quick onboard system, which guides the fine-grained execution of these programs. So Milner and Goodall propose that a similar division exists in the cortical visual system. The ventral system outputs to a broad functioning cognitive system, enabling smart but slow selection of action programs. And the dorsal system outputs directly to action systems to enable dumb but quick guidance of those programs. So if, for example, I aim to catch a ball hit in the outfield, ventral stream information is employed in determining what to do and roughly how to do it. So I assess the trajectory of the ball, see that it's headed towards my part of the field, and make a rough estimate of where I need to move my body and arm to intercept it. Thus, the ventral stream and downstream cognitive activity are analogous to the Martian rover's controller system using the Earth system. But the action program selected by cognition is itself vague. Roughly, cognition's output is a set of conditional motor commands. Dorsal stream's role is to supply online the antecedents of those conditionals. This is analogous to the Martian rover's quick and dirty onboard systems. So for example, as the ball arcs, I might move my body in order to keep a constant angle between the horizon and the ball, ensuring that I arrive at the bottom of the arc. Right? So that kind of online guidance of my activity. Is what dorsal stream seems to be involved in. So I'm going to be largely assuming this picture of the two visual streams, but my defense of that model is not complete, and I think it's worth clarifying my commitments by responding to two kinds of evidence that have been raised against the model. Three kinds. Specifically, on Milner and Goodall's preferred interpretation, the ventral and dorsal streams constitute isolated perceptual processing systems, each of which has a proprietary function. But each of these claims, that is the isolation claim and the proprietary function claim, has been challenged in the empirical literature. So first, there's evidence from neuroanatomical studies for functional connectivity between the two streams, which likely results in informational connectivity as well. Thus, it looks like each stream performs computations which operate over representations from the other stream. This is a problem for Milner and Goodall since they assume that the two streams are independent processing subsystems. This evidence seems to challenge their independence. Second, there's evidence for dorsal stream's influence on conscious experience. The nature of that influence isn't exactly clear, but the empirical literature has proposed influence of dorsal stream on ventral stream object representations or spatial attention or both. So the philosopher Mohan Mathan has suggested that dorsal stream influences experiences feeling of presence, basically the idea that there's an object out there as opposed to a mere representation of some object or other. While Wayne Wu has suggested dorsal stream influences experiences egocentric format, the idea that it's centered on me. These proposals challenge Milner and Goodall's picture because they claim that ventral stream is because Milner and Goodall claim that ventral stream is uniquely responsible for conscious experience. Third, there's evidence for ventral stream influence on online motor control. So Robert Briscoe and John Schwenkler have summarized this evidence quite well, I think, in proposing a kind of two systems account of the two visual streams. The idea is that dorsal stream guides motor activity when performing familiar automatic tasks, but ventral stream is involved in the guidance of more complex, deliberate tasks. Again, this kind of evidence challenges Milner and Goodall's picture because they claim that dorsal stream is uniquely responsible for online motor control. Okay, so in a different paper, I've argued that these three problems are not devastating objections to Milner and Goodall's first-order account, as long as we understand that account in a particular way, specifically defending what I call representational functional division. That is, we should think of the separate streams as we shouldn't think of the separate streams as isolated perceptual systems, but rather as sets of computations that are kind of largely organized around functionally individuated representation types. Specifically, what that says is, first, that ventral stream contains the primary representations driving program selection. Second, that dorsal stream contains the primary representations driving program guidance. And third, that the separate streams are largely organized around the creation of these representations respectively. This weaker account, I think, allows us to defend the central functional claims of Milner and Goodall's model without being directly challenged by the three problems I just raised. So in other words, we shouldn't think either that the streams have proprietary function or that they're strictly speaking independent. Rather, we should understand streams as kind of largely organized around these separate functions, even if they have interactions. So one reason I wanted to discuss these three challenges is, again, to explain that the version of the streams that I think is worth defending is not one on which we have isolated systems with proprietary functions, but this different view on which we have computational units largely organized around functionally individuated representation types. The other reason I wanted to discuss these objections is that while I don't think these empirical issues are problems for representational functional division, an answer to the first order question, I do think that these latter two are issues for task-based division as an answer to the second order question. And I'm going to make that point shortly. Okay, so that's enough of the two streams for a moment. What about this so-called low road of the subcortical visual system? The basic idea, as I said, is that the low road functions to trigger certain fight, flight, or freeze responses to threatening stimuli. So as we'll see, one of my objections to task-based division relies in part on the widely accepted claim that this threat detection system exists, that is, that the low road has the function that I've been saying it does, and that it's independently responsible for triggering a select class of action programs, such as freezing or fleeing. Okay, so the preceding remarks concern the first order function of each individual stream. But as I said, this talk is about the second order function of functional division. And there are at least two ways to understand function when answering that second order question. So first, there's a descriptive sense, the sense we use when we say that a flathead screwdriver can function as a pry bar. That's the sense in which we're merely describing the kind of capacity of some kind of system or object or what have you. The descriptive version of the second order question is, how does the functionally divided visual system divide up processing labor? But there's also a teleological sense of function, as in the function of the heart is to pump blood, this, the classic example. The teleological version of the second order question is, what purpose does a particular division of labor serve? So the aim here, my aim in this talk, is to address both senses of the second order question. I'm going to be saying something about how the visual system divides up labor between these three different streams, and I'm going to provide an account of why it does that. But I want to flag from the beginning that answering the teleological version of the second order question is intrinsically more difficult and thus more controversial than answering the descriptive version. So what I'm going to be doing is gesturing at a broad evolutionary account of the development of the three streams that largely relies on Kim Strelny's work on the evolution of perception and cognition. My claim is going to be that there are certain selection pressures that privilege certain kinds of divisions of labor, and that those selection pressures likely existed in the past. Proving these sorts of claims, though, is of course extremely difficult, and I'm not going to offer anything here like proof. Rather, I think what we should see in what I'm offering is something like Strelny, which is a reasonable evolutionary bet. Now, you might not like attempts to answer the teleological question in this way. For one, it's possible that functional division occurred by accident, for example, as a mere consequence of certain developmental constraints, and that it therefore lacks a teleological function at all. So recent critiques of evolutionary or functional analyses of biological systems have made clear that we're often too quick to jump to adaptive explanations where more mundane explanations are available. Sometimes traits occur as the result of trait-level selection, the kind of explanation I'm going to be suggesting, but sometimes they occur as mere spandrels of selection elsewhere, or simply by coincidence. Complex biological systems result from a hodgepodge of causal factors. But a plausible functional analysis of a biological system is nonetheless telling, even in face of these kind of underdetermination of the evidence. It points to places where an adaptive explanation is available and where adaptation may have played an important, even if incomplete, role in the development of a trait. And plausible functional analyses are useful frames through which we can view biological systems. They guide us toward testable predictions about the behavior of those systems, and independently of their truth, they therefore can play an indispensable heuristic role. So it's in this sense in which I mean to be offering a kind of answer to the teleological question. Okay, so the second order question might not seem pressing if you're familiar with other divisions of visual processing. It's a common feature of visual processing that different features of the digital scene are processed by different regions in the visual system. Thus, for example, there are dedicated regions associated with the processing of color, motion, form, space, and so forth. So why, you might ask, should we be surprised that perceptual systems also divide according to downstream task? But two features of task-based division should surprise us and I think call out for an explanation. First, the different visual processing streams, especially the ventral and dorsal streams, recruit very different regions of cortex. When compared to the brain as a whole, the parietal and temporal lobes are not close. This is in sharp contrast with other divisions of the visual systems. Color and motion are processed separately but closely together, and this allows for rapid crosstalk between the two, as is appropriate for processing tasks with related contents, and which jointly determine a unified distal scene. So the question is, why should a similar principle not apply to visual processing for different tasks? Second, on the standard models of task-based division, the visual system employs otherwise surprising redundancies. Thus, for example, Milner and Goodell argue that the ventral and dorsal streams separately produce spatial representations of the distal scene. Such redundancy appears to waste resources that might be better employed for different functions. So the question is, why should such large-scale redundancy exist? An answer to the second order question should help us address these issues. That is, they should explain why it is that we would use substantially different regions of cortex for these different tasks, and they should explain why this redundancy is beneficial, even if, again, redundant and potentially a waste of resources. Okay, so that's the preliminaries aside. My next goal is to articulate the kind of standard answer to the second order question, what I call task-based division. So first, a bit of framing. So the literature on the two streams has largely been dominated by two models. On an earlier model, the division between ventral and dorsal streams was not between tasks, like guidance and selection, but rather between contents. On this model, the ventral stream functioned to determine the features of objects, while the dorsal stream functioned to determine the spatial relationship between those objects. Following this picture, the streams are sometimes referred to as what and where pathways. In defending their newer model, Milner and Goodall provide substantial evidence that both object features and spatial representations are processed in each stream, so this undermines the purported division between what and where. But researchers have also pointed to another apparent problem with the what and where account, which is that it seems to make it harder to answer the second order question. So what I said above was that an odd feature of the ventral and dorsal streams is that they seem to dedicate substantially different regions of cortex to processing visual information. An answer to the second order question should explain why it would be beneficial to separate out presumably related visual information in this way. This problem is particularly pressing if you adopt the what and where view, since obviously these two pieces of information are pretty strongly related. We use spatial information to determine object identity and vice versa. That is, this particular answer to the first order question seems to make it harder to answer the second order question of why the division exists to begin with. So basically what these researchers are suggesting are something of a desideratum on a first order account, which is that an account which aims to answer the first order question, that is a claim about the function of each individual streams, should be consistent with a plausible answer to the second order question about what the function of that division is to begin with. And it seems like this earlier account kind of doesn't meet this desideratum. So Milner and Goodall think that they're on better grounds here. That is, they think they can answer the question of why there should be such a separation. That is, that it helps address conflicting task demands. They argue that this task-based functional division is the best solution to the complex task of flexibly selecting while rapidly guiding action programs. Selection and guidance place conflicting demands on the computational systems that underlie them. Thus, adequate performance on both tasks requires a divide and conquer strategy. So specifically, they point to several several instances of these kinds of conflicts between the computational requirements for guidance and the computational requirements for selection. So first, rapid program guidance requires high temporal resolution. So if I'm trying to catch a falling pen, for example, I need rapid updating of the location of my arm in response to visual information about the location of the pen. Flexible program selection, by contrast, requires high spatial resolution. So if I want to identify a familiar face, for example, that requires attention to fine-grained details. But speed and detail place conflicting demands on computational systems. The faster the processing, the less fine-grained detail can be sussed out. The more detail, the longer it takes to process. Okay, so that's one example of a conflict between these two tasks. Second, rapid program guidance requires rapid updating. The precise current angle between my arm and the pen matters a great deal at the moment, but not at all in 50 milliseconds. By contrast, flexible program selection requires long storage duration. The system deciding which button to press in the elevator, for example, needs to know which button it was appropriate to press last time. Since storage requires resources, and since rewriting a stored representation takes time and energy, long storage and rapid updating place conflicting demands on computational systems. Third, Milner and Goodall argue that rapid guidance is best performed from within an egocentric, that is, agent-centered spatial frame. What matters for grabbing the pen is the precise angle between my arm, that is, my arm from the perspective of where I'm looking, and the distal pen, not the location of the pen in objective space. And they argue that flexible selection, on the other hand, is best performed from within an allocentric, that is, object-centered spatial frame. So if you think about deciding where to look for my keys, it doesn't matter precisely where my body was located with respect to the location I saw them last. It merely matters where those keys were in objective space. Since allocentric and egocentric spatial frames are different, and since translating between them requires time and resources, this too is another conflicting computational demand. Finally, rapid guidance requires certain contents, such as, for example, precise joint angles not required for flexible selection, while flexible selection requires certain contents, such as the distinction between my pen and someone else's, not required for rapid guidance. Since computational resources are not infinite, and since computing over more contents requires greater resources and time, this is another example of a conflicting computational demand. So since the domain two tasks conflict, a single resource-limited system would be forced to make trade-offs, favoring either the speed, storage, spatial format or contents of one or the other of these tasks at the cost of the other. A divided system, on the other hand, can allocate separate processing resources to each task, maximizing overall performance. In short, not only are the first-order functional claims of Milner and Goodell's model borne out by the evidence, they argue, but this functional division itself makes computational sense. And the latter second-order functional claim entails positive predictions. So we should expect, for example, that the dorsal stream, which is responsible for program guidance, to process stimuli rapidly, to store representations for a relatively short period of time, and so forth. And we should expect the ventral stream, which is responsible for program selection, to process stimuli relatively more slowly, with more detail and tagging, and so forth. And they argue 30 years of neuroscientific research largely confirms these various predictions. So it looks like Milner and Goodell's account have meet this desideratum where the earlier account doesn't. So what I'm about to say is that their answer, this task-based division, in fact doesn't meet this desideratum because their answer to the second order division actually isn't very consistent with current empirical evidence. So let's turn to that now. So specifically, I'm going to be raising 3 challenges for this task-based division. Sorry, I'm going to get a drink. So here are the 3 challenges: multi-stream guidance, multi-stream selection, and evolutionary concerns. So as I said before, the first 2 issues are 2 of the issues I raised above for Milner and Goodell's first-order account. And I said that these problems are actually consistent with that account so long as we understand the division between streams as organized around functionally individuated representations rather than isolated perceptual processing systems. But I do think these problems are problems for a second-order account, relying on task-based division. To see this, go back to the purported advantages of the divide and conquer strategy. The idea was that the different streams have different functional characteristics which assist in their dedicated functional roles. Dorsal stream has high temporal resolution to assist in the performance of the guidance role, and ventral stream has high spatial resolution to assist in the performance of the selection role, and so on. But notice that if both streams are operative in the performance of each task, that is guidance and selection, this basic picture breaks down. If dorsal stream relies on ventral stream representations and program guidance, then it has to wait around, so to speak, for those representations to process. More generally, once there are multiple streams performing each role, it simply cannot be as simple as the idea that separate streams performing isolated functions is the optimal solution to conflicting computational demands. Something more complicated must be going on. That is, the task-based division story leaves unanswered the crucial question about what differentiates, for example, cases of program guidance performed by dorsal stream from those performed by ventral stream. So why allocate the different streams for respective functions when we do? And this answer to the second order question simply doesn't answer these questions. That's the basic challenge for the task-based division account. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to look at them each in turn. So let's take a look first at multi-stream guidance. So I wanted to give you an idea of the kind of thing we're talking about. So here's an early lesion study that Milner and Goodell cite in favor of their account. So they performed a set of experiments on a patient known as DF. So DF had isolated ventral stream damage, leading to what's known as visual form agnosia, an inability to consciously perceive and report visual form. So in one group of experiments, Milner and Goodell asked DF to first try to consciously report the angles of certain gradients. So the line on the left, for example, is at 30 degrees from the y-axis. In keeping with DF's general agnosia, they proved no better than chance at this task. Their guesses were all over the place. They then asked DF to try to fit a disk through a slot at the same angles. Something, it looked kind of like this. So imagine the orange thing is a disk and the blue thing was a slot that they're trying to fit it through. So to be clear, DF was not allowed to perform the task by trial and error. Otherwise, you might think they simply felt the outlines of the slot and then fit it through. A trial was over when DF either fit the disk through the slot or bumped substantially against the surround. But what they found was surprising. DF reliably fit the disk through the slot. This again despite the fact that DF could not report even basic information about the angle of that slot. So Milner and Goodell suggest that DF's intact dorsal stream processes are responsible for this performance. While she has a deficit in her ability to consciously experience visual forms, she has an intact ability to guide her behavior using those forms. This is an initial sort of evidence that dorsal stream is independently responsible for guiding online motor activity. But things get more complicated when they place replace the simple straight slot with a T-shaped one, a slightly more difficult task. So in these experiments, DF was only able to fit the T through the slot on about half the trials. In the other trials, they were more often off by about 90 degrees in either direction. So Milner and Goodall suggest that while the simpler task is performed using only dorsal stream in neurotypical subjects, this more complicated task also requires recruitment of ventral stream. And since DF has damage to ventral stream, this would explain her deficit in performing this particular task. To be clear, I'm not expecting you to be convinced by this study. I'm just trying to give you an example of the kind of complexity that seems to suggest ventral stream involvement in certain online motor tasks. Okay, so I said this sort of evidence isn't really a problem for Milner and Goodall's basic first-order claim about the central function of each visual stream. So they claim that dorsal stream has the function of basic guidance and motor activity, and it's perfectly consistent with that claim that ventral stream occasionally assists in that guidance. So why is this a problem for the second-order claim? Well, simply put, task-based division only captures the evidence if the streams are uniformly functionally divided according to task. If ventral stream assists in program guidance, then division cannot be justified by the claim that the dorsal stream has the unique properties necessary for guidance. We need a more complicated story here. Specifically, we need to be able to say why and when ventral stream's slow and intelligent method should assist in program guidance, and that division is going to be about the computational profile of the streams, not about their respective tasks. In other words, once we acknowledge that both streams are involved in program guidance, task-based division leaves unanswered the now crucial question, why are there different streams? Why does dorsal stream usually guide programs but not all of the time? What's special about the situation in which ventral stream guides, that sort of thing. So we should